So, firstly, just to acknowledge a couple of people, I'm delighted to see Rob and Rune here. Obviously, tremendous inspiration to us all over many, many years, not just here, but obviously in terms of your work. And, I knew nothing about alcohol when I came into it, and your work has been just tremendous to me. And so delighted to see you here, and thank you for that, and the Kettle Brewing Society and everything that went with that. So I'm thrilled with that. And also to thank Paula O'Brien for helping to organise this particular event. I'm thrilled with it. And again, similarly, Paula's work, certainly that paper in 2018 on the bottle has been a magnificent clarity to a whole range of subjects that at the time were very important. So just to acknowledge both of you, and I'm really thrilled to see you here and to thank you for that. So today, I've been asked to kind of just talk about the experience in Ireland and what had occurred in Ireland. And obviously we have legislated for, most of you in the room probably will know, some of you online hopefully will know, that Ireland, as of last May, has now enshrined into law a set of measures around alcohol warnings on alcohol products, which will come into place in May 2026. It'll be physically on the products. So to kind of that's the center theme of our talk. So these are the kind of the four topics that we just want to talk through. So I just want to kind of give you a little bit of background to, well, why did Ireland do what they did, and what was the footprint and what was the harm of alcohol in Ireland, and to kind of give people a sense of that. And then kind of talk a little bit about that kind of 20-year period of what I call the kind of the slow march to change. And it was a slow march, but as we all know in this game, it's incremental. It's bit by bit you get there. So look a little bit of that, and then maybe just talk a little bit about the level of commercial opposition to it. What were the central themes and the tactics? And again, some of this will be well rehearsed for you, but just kind of give the context to us. And then what did we do on that kind of advocacy on the public health side to try and counter that? What was the forces that were at work there, and consider the change makers, as I call them, in that space. And then look just more detail, if we have the time, hopefully just look more detail around the making of the actual regulations that were introduced into Ireland and that process over the last kind of 12 to 18 months, to try and give that a little bit of context. So we're going to look at alcohol use in Ireland. Just very briefly, Ireland's a population about the size of Melbourne. There's about 5 million people. And this is the most recent set of data. So about 3.5 million of those population are over the age of 18 who can legally drink in Ireland, and about 75% of those, not dissimilar to the world in some Western world countries, about 75% of them drink. So you've got about 2.6 million that are drinkers. However, using the WHO Audit C screening tool, which you're something you'll be familiar with, you can see that we have a real problem. About half of those drinkers have a classified issue in relation to hazardous alcohol use. And when you break that down even further into the prevalence of alcohol use disorder, there's about 15% of that population that is really, really significant. And to the best of my opinion, I'm sure Robin probably have a better, that level of alcohol use at that level is around 6 or 7% in most populations. So I think in Ireland at nearly 15%, you can begin to see the difficulty. So we have just over 500,000, nearly 600,000 people in our country with a real problem in relation to alcohol. And obviously that varies according to the scale and the criteria of alcohol use disorder, but it is a major problem. So very briefly, what does that look like? This is data from 2021. And on the left-hand side, you'll just see a breakdown. So in Ireland, we measure alcohol consumption across 4 criteria, which is beer, wine, spirits, and cider for some particular reason. And so we determined the level of use by revenue excise duty divided by the number of population. And so we did the work on breaking down what each individual drinker was drinking in Ireland on an annual basis. So on the left-hand side, you'll see that each drinker was consuming around 235 cans of beer, 11 bottles of spirits, 39 bottles of wine, and around 35 cans of cider. That's each and every drinker in the country. So it's quite profound. And when you break it down across the level of population that is drinking, the per capita is around 12.5 litres per capita. Well, if you were to go looking at the Irish figures, it's about 10.8 or thereabouts. But when you bring it actually down to the actual drinkers, it's a good deal higher. So here's the nuts and bolts of that. I mean, these are just a couple of the headlines, but I mean, what does it look like? What's happening on a day-to-day basis? And again, the figures here are quite startling. The health, to manage the cost in relation to the health alcohol-related illnesses and harm is costing the Irish Exchequer just a little shy of 2 billion annually. Now, you'd say, well, 2 billion, what's 2 billion in the context? Well, the expenditure of the Irish government on an annual basis is about 55 billion. So you can kind of get a sense of what's involved here. The health, about 11% of our annual health budget has been dedicated to alcohol-related harms. Again, makes absolutely no sense that that level of expenditure has been given out. And then across the more broader implications for the society, when you bring in criminal justice, children protection, social protection issues, that figure rises to about 3.6 billion. So it's at an economic cost, it is quite significant. But obviously at a social cost, the impact is huge. So about 4 people a day are dying in Ireland in relation to alcohol use. And again, small population, but four deaths a day is quite a significant occurrence. And in terms of alcohol-related cancers, there's about 1,000 people every year. And in particular, Ireland has an outlier issue in relation to female breast cancers, which is, there's a story behind that data, but I'll come to that in due course. But it's about just over 12% of female breast cancers are alcohol-related. And I think, again, Robin probably would have a better handle to this, but I think it's around 7 or 8% at a global level. So the outlier for Ireland is quite significant. And so then just at the end there, despite all of that, we do recruit about 60,000 children to start drinking in Ireland every year from the ages of 14 or 15. They'll be brought into the stream of revenue for the alcohol industry at a very early age. So your next slide there, please. So this just looks at the official figures in relation to the data in terms of litre per capita. And as you can see, broadly since around the start of the 2010 decade, levels of alcohol consumption have been fairly consistent. And the red line indicates what is the government target. That's inherent in the Public Health Alcohol Act as it now is. But it just kind of, again, to give you an idea of just how steady the level of consumption is. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we move in through the May. So this is just we're going to talk a little bit about the Public Health Alcohol Act and that kind of, as I said, that slow march of change. Next slide, please. And specifically, we want to look at labelling, and we want to look at what is Section 12 of that Act, and it's called Labelling of Alcohol Products and Notice in Licensed Premises. And a lot of talk tends to get featured on the labelling, on the product, but obviously there's also another side of it whereby alcohol products, when they're sold in a shop or in a premises, an alcohol licensed premises, there's also an intention to display the information on what is a non-container of alcohol. So, so this process really began back in 2001 in terms of just the Irish government's approach to the broad alcohol-related problems that we were suffering, or enduring, I should say. When we went through an economic boom in the latter end of the 20th century, and it drove really hedonistic period in relation to alcohol use. And so we got to a stage by 2001 where it was around 14.3 litres per capita, which is obviously significantly higher than it is now. But literally people were dropping in the streets in relation to alcohol. It was just crazy stuff. It was like the last days of Rome. But so the government has resolved at that point to recognise that Ireland was having a serious problem in relation to alcohol, and that something would have to be done about it. And of course, at that time, the political landscape was largely been driven by a neoliberal type of government arrangement of a centre-right party and a centre party. And so, the government's first port of call was to turn to the industry to resolve its issues as it presented it. And so it established this strategic task force to which the industry were sitting on, and we're sitting at the table. And interestingly enough, at that time, recommendation 6, as you can see it there at the bottom, was to require a health label warning on all alcohol products and alcohol promotional materials. And that was 2004. That's 20 years ago. And that was the first real recognition of it. Next slide, please. Now, that period of between kind of 2002 and 2009, essentially, largely nothing was achieved. There was a couple of reports, but the neoliberal approach, which said the government shouldn't intervene into the market or place any curb on demand, was largely taken in place. Now, having said that, alcohol reduction did occur, and that was largely because there was an economic downturn, and government resolved taxation regimes to try and drive down some of the alcohol use. So it increased excise duty on a number of products, and that did help as well. So this is just an overview of that kind of period of 2009, 2012, what occurred. And a lot of things occurred around that period. First and foremost, the government recognized that it did have a problem again, and it would have to take a slightly different approach. So it established this steering group in relation to alcohol misuse. And again, the alcohol industry were participating in that, but there was a different leadership team involved, who was essentially our chief medical officer, who's recently retired from the role, but his leadership was critical to this. Around that time, obviously, the first global real strategy from the WHO came. Around this time, the European Union obviously exempted the alcohol industry from placing any warnings or any detail on their products in what became known as the EU Directive of 1169. Some of you may be familiar with that. 2012, then the European WHO Europe produced their strategy, and again, it was one of the first to really profoundly establish that idea of health warnings should be placed on all alcohol beverage containers as part of a broader communication and point of purchase health campaigns to reduce harmful use of alcohol, and that was important. And then, so the 2009 group essentially reported in 2012, took them 3 years essentially, and that was after a row with the industry having to produce a minority written report themselves. And again, its recommendation was pretty clear. You'll see it there at the bottom. Labels on alcohol products sold in Ireland should include a number of grams of alcohol per container, along with calorific content, health warnings, and in relation to consuming alcohol and pregnancy. So that was, again, a fairly clear position in relation to what was been recommended. My involvement in all of this began as 2012, because prior to 2012, I was a political hack. I ran campaigns, I was a political advisor. And one morning I woke up and found myself in the Department of Health as a ministerial advisor. And a civil servant came knocking on my door with a very large brown manila envelope and said, "We have a problem with alcohol. Do you think you might be able to do something with that?" That was my introduction to alcohol. So that period between 2012 and 2013, there was a year of political negotiation. So we were at that time in a centre-left government. And there was a political crisis around alcohol. That was one of the issues. And so we had to go through a political process of negotiation to try and agree what would emerge out of the national steering, the steering group's recommendations, to actually form a memorandum to government that would subsequently form the basis of the legislation. And so that agreement was reached in October 2013. And the memorandum to government said that there would be the drafting of a health-orientated public health bill to provide for, amongst other things, and we're focusing on labelling, that there would be messages and advice, and that's the wording that was in the memorandum. And this is the wording that was in the memorandum, that the placing of health to include pregnancy advice and warning to all alcohol drink containers and on promotional materials. Secondly, the display and amount of pure alcohol as measured in grams and the calorie content contained etc., etc. You can see what they are, and the consumer will be better informed. That was the height of the objective. That was what informed government decision in relation to proceeding to this particular matter. It took 2 years from that point to actually get the bill drafted, and obviously the bill is a much broader piece, and we'll see that in due course. But again, the process prior to it being brought in, there was parliamentary scrutiny, which endorsed the labelling provisions. So the next slide, please. It came into the House. Like Australia, we have a bicameral system, so the bill actually came into the upper house first rather than the lower house. And so it began its journey in December 2015. In June 2016, the whole bill, the entire bill, was notified to the WTO, which I'm sure Paula knows all about. And then it got to second stage in October 2016, and there was an incredible political kerfuffle in the upper house, and the bill had to be withdrawn at that point. So we were back to square one, largely. There was no, whilst there was consensus in government, there wasn't consensus in the parliament. And at that time, there was a couple of amendments, which are very significant amendments, were placed into the legislation by opposition members of the House. The first being the warning that's intended to inform the public of the direct link between alcohol and fatal cancers. Now, the reason that's important, obviously, is because it wasn't government policy. It was the opposition who essentially drove that. And what drove that essentially was an NGO, the NGO community. And it was the Irish Cancer Society of Ireland who largely drove that, along with Alcohol Action Ireland at the time. So obviously democracy is a messy business, but that's where it came in. There also was an amendment that tried to ensure that the label, whatever warning would be on the label, would be about a third. Essentially, the amendment was where at least 1/3 of the printed material would be given over to evidence-based health warnings. The difficulty with all of that meant that the government then had to re-notify the European Union in relation to what was now the process. And so in January 18, having come through the upper house and the minister accepting both of these amendments at the time, it went back to Europe, back to Brussels for further scrutiny. And again, you'll find that online if anyone's interested in looking at the detail of that EU trust process and the submissions. But what's interesting about that, I think, is that at the time, there was only six government, six industry opposition to it, including the Winemakers Federation of Australia. And there was 18 public health submissions. And what's interesting about that process is that the European Union eventually closed that process in July of 2018 and made no comment, what they say, no comment on what Ireland was recommending. Now, the reason that was important is because it then gave Ireland the space to go ahead and enact the legislation, which it did do. It eventually went through the lower house and it was enacted and signed by the president in October 2018. So it kind of, if you can imagine that, starting from the steering committee and strategy in 2009, you get to 2018. So it's taken 9 years essentially to get to this point. So the next slide, I just want to briefly look at, well, what was it? I won't bore you with all the details, but obviously the government's intention was driven largely by the echoing the best buys and indeed the recommendations from, no ordinary product or no ordinary commodity. To look at the main drivers of demand for alcohol and attack those 4 Ps in terms of product, price, place, and promotion. So the legislation essentially has 12 key measures in it. And of course, the first and most important one probably in some instances was the introduction of minimum unit pricing. And it set standard drink in Ireland essentially at €1. Now, Ireland's real problem with alcohol was the level of alcohol that was being consumed in the off-trade. And the off-trade was the Wild West when it came to pricing. You could buy alcohol in Ireland cheaper than you could buy milk, essentially. So it attracted pricing. It obviously introduced labelling issues. Crucially, it has legislated in relation to the content of advertising, but that hasn't been commenced yet. That's why the X is there. it restricted the prohibition of advertising in certain places. That meant largely around schools, public parks, that type of thing. Restriction during certain events, that was during sporting events, not in the stadium, but on the actual playing area. And for a while, what that did was it took alcohol brands off the pitch. It's quite a narrow, but nevertheless important one. Children's clothing, again, you could no longer sell children's clothing with alcohol brands in it. Remarkably, we did. We do have a devotion. You know, some people call us the Republic. A friend of mine or a colleague of mine always refers to us as the Republic of Diageo, as opposed to the Republic of Ireland. So yeah, advertising and publications and the broadcast watershed. But what broadcast watershed is to ban alcohol advertising before 9 o'clock at night. And I just heard this morning that has now been commenced. So that X is no longer there. Now it is a tick. And so from January 2025, there will be a watershed in relation to broadcasting alcohol products. Advertising in cinemas, you could only advertise in cinemas if the showing was over 18. Separation and visibility of license of product. Now that was the most contentious part, because essentially what it was doing was stripping alcohol out of the retail environment and putting it back in behind a wall. And it caused absolute mayhem in relation to this. And the regulation sales supply, which
this is in grocery stores?
Yes, exactly. In mixed retail units. In Ireland, you can, again, ironically, you can go to the post office and buy alcohol in Ireland. So not a great idea. Or you can go to a petrol station and buy alcohol. But yeah, so essentially what it did was it just took it from being seen beside milk and children's goods and putting it into somewhere separate. And initially it was intended to be divided by a wall, but that didn't happen. It actually got weakened. The regulation of sale of supply was important because a lot of supermarkets were using alcohol to drive, promotion of other goods and offering 2-for-1s and 3-for-1s, etc. And so they were all prohibited in relation to this. And actually, I think has been significant. So this was just to kind of give you a look at, what the opposition looked like, the commercial opposition. And these is the head of Hydra, essentially. I mean, there's like 18, 19 different organizations here, essentially, all just one body, which is alcohol industry. And they were, constantly reinforming, other than the public affairs consultancies, I should say, to be fair. But everybody else was largely just an invention of the alcohol industry, either established or encouraged to oppose the measures within the bill. And as you can imagine, most of the media, for example, were opposed to it because there's a lot of stuff around media. And the retailers were largely opposed to it as well, for obvious reasons.
Well, the media gets advertised.
Huh?
The media gets advertised.
Exactly. And that broadcast watershed, we reckoned, in relation to our national broadcaster, is worth about 15 million annually. So it's a significant factor. So just the reason I'm showing you this is because I want to show you the next slide, which essentially is just a piece of work we did in 2020, but we will look back on 2018 to try and understand what was the level of lobbying like at that time. And so in 2018, there was, the industry lobbied government and government figures about 350 occasions. And what did that look like? Well, it looked like 8 of the alcohol producers in the country, top 4 global industries came to Ireland knocking on government doors. And so they got access to 8 cabinet ministers, etc. You can see the full detail of it there, but you can see that it's quite an free access to the powers of government. And so that idea of the alcohol industry sitting as a shadow beside government is played out and just demonstrated here quite clearly. So next slide. So we wanted to just have a quick look at, well, what was the main opposition to what were they trying to do? And again, Robin will be familiar with all of this. It's the classic playbook in relation to what they did, but they denied the scientific evidence. They questioned and ridiculed that evidence largely as well. They spoke about the costs around designing a specific Irish label, which again, rather, limited argument in some ways. They said it was an unnecessary a barrier to trade. And again, we obviously countered that. They spoke of catastrophic effects to the Irish alcohol industry. They spoke in terms of that the warnings that were being proposed were a blunt assertion, and these are all documented in their lobbying returns. And they, of course, always relied on the EU as the ones that were going to resolve the problem. Now, if you go back to the 2004 Strategic Alcohol Force, the recommendation that was in that very first time, the line after said, of course, we recognize that the EU is going to resolve this problem in due course. That was in 2004. Anyways, these are just a couple of examples. If you're joining us online, you'll be able to take that Twitter address and have a look. And this woman on the left-hand side was the head of the alcohol industry in Ireland. And she went on national television and flatly denied there was a link between alcohol and cancer. And she didn't do it once, she did it 3 times. And this is a live recording of it, or a recording of it. You'd be able to hear her dulcet tones denying that link. And so we this is the kind of the ridicule that we got into, about whether it was burnt toast or whether it was alcohol. That went on for quite some time. Next slide. And these are just examples then of, this character on the left-hand side. He's now he's the non-executive head of alcohol industry in Ireland, runs a gin company. And again, he went on significantly talking about the damage, the reputational damage to the Irish alcohol industry, which shows no signs of slowing down, can I just tell you? No signs at all. I mean, they're recording 8-10% growth every year. And he's at the forefront because gin is one of his products. And so you had the classic, they hired guns for hire. This is where they outlined the cost of the labelling, that it would be approximately 50,000. Now, they did no analysis on this. There's nothing backing this figure up at all. So the arguments, and I would have had these arguments on the public airways saying, we did the work and we looked and we found, you could do 10,000 labels for 800 quid. And they were talking in terms of 50,000 and never backed anything up. It was just, ludicrous stuff, but that's the way it was. And similarly with the Vintners Association, with their blunt assertion that it was a blunt assertion. Next slide there, Debbie. So again, as I say, the classic playbook, they denied the link. They did, there was a campaign run by the National Controlled Cancer Programme and the health executive around this issue about 1 in 8 breast cancers. And they flooded the National Control Cancer Programme with FOIs, freedom of information, in relation to this data. And they wanted to know where it was come from. And it got particularly nasty, really nasty. And some of the key people involved in the National Cancer Control Programme retired early. And, it was quite a significant battle. But these ideas, manufacturing false debate, Ireland's reputation, that played well with the public. They rolled out the small brewers all the time to say, these poor little fellas, how are they going to manage? The cost implications, and constantly encouraging filibustering and writing speeches for members of the Parliament, who were delivering them exactly verbatim, one for one, days upon days upon days, to disrupt the process. Next slide there. So very briefly, just want to have a look, so I wanted to kind of give you a flavor of what that commercial opposition looked like, and then what did it look like on our side, shall we say, on the public health side. And so one of the most effective things that Ireland did was that it established, in fairness, it copied something that had come out of the UK. Rob will be familiar with, I'm sure, and Paul, of the Alcohol Health Alliance in the UK. So Ireland did a similar version of that. So the next slide there. So just let that run for a second. So you can see this was 58 voices, essentially, all speaking in one voice about what was important. Get this bill passed. So we have a whole range of NGOs in heart, cancer, mental health, student organizations, youth organizations, children's organizations, drugs organizations, suicide organizations, all the way through social justice, alcohol obviously involved. And so you had a whole community, a whole community that was amplified into one single voice. And that was really probably the most powerful thing we did, you know, in trying to bring about the legislative change. Now, it did take obviously time, but having that at your back as the advocacy campaign was hugely important. Next slide. And similarly, when we understood, and in fairness, we took us a little bit of time to understand the European dynamic, we obviously had to shift our public affairs campaign and our strategy into Europe to try and find friends in Europe. And so we spent a lot of time in 2017 building those alliances across Europe, which became very important. And in fact, the EU commissioner at the time in DG Sante was particularly helpful. It was him who essentially stood by the decision to say that regulation that exempted the alcohol products would have to end. And that was the first time that had been done. And next slide. So these are just a quick snapshot of some of the organizations that we would have tried to work with at the time. Next. So that was kind of the key to the NGO campaign. So now I just want to have a brief look at just the regulations that occurred. And so the regulations which came into law last May, they were essentially published in June the previous year. But one of the things that we did that was kind of important was to bring public support and try and build recognition around public support for this. So we were constantly doing polling. So this looks at the question was, do you think that health products must display, or alcohol products must display health warnings? And so you can see there's a reasonable level of support, of strongly support, intended support, which is tipping near over 70% in support, whereas in actual fact the opposition was really, really small, which was really important. And the next slide. Similarly, in this was the question was, did consumers have a right, or citizens have a right to be informed of that? And again, obviously, when you mention consumers or citizens in the question, you get a little bit of an up spike. So over 40% strongly supported it, and 31% tended to support it. So again, over 70% very much in favour of it, very little opposition. And so having this data constantly been updated was part of our campaign. Next slide there. So this is what the actual draft regulations as published in June 2022, what they look like. And so the bottles on the right-hand side and the products, we in Alcohol Action at the time got these factioned up to show people what it was like, and so it's pretty powerful, I think, in its sense, but also modest. It's quite modest, and that was part of our thinking, was that we would demonstrate to people that what was being proposed wasn't radical in too much, but it was important to demonstrate it. The regulations, just to make a quick point, regulations on the display in premises and in places where alcohol was sold. It wasn't just the symbol of the pregnant woman. It was also a line. It is also a line that says, if you drink alcohol, there's harm to your baby. Harm to your baby. So it's quite a stark. And we fought a bit of a battle with the Department of Health to try and get that wording on the actual label. And so, we were a little disappointed that we didn't get that. But you can see it's quite a useful presentation. So next slide. So this is just very briefly. The regulation was published in 22. They went to the EU. This time around, we got 90 submissions. Remember the last time it was only 24? Now it was 90. So there was things were taken off. But we were able to corral and encourage and get the support of 60 global public health organizations from Canada through to Australia, across Europe. It was really tremendous and very, very heartening to have that level of support from the global community to echo what was a really important thing. The industry, again, they bought in science. They bought in a number of reports, which you can see online, very detailed, from the United States, and denying the link between liver cancer, denying the link not so much denying the link, but say, you know, muddying the waters in relation to what was the impact. And so it goes through the similar process again. We get to the point in December 2022 when the EU again makes no comment, the Commission makes no comment, publishes no comment, and that gives Ireland the freedom then to say, okay, we're good to go. We'll take the flak, but we're good to go. And so the minister, the standstill period, then it was notified to the WHO in February of 2023. And that standstill period ended in May 2023. And again, there was a lot of comment and opposition to it. But again, the government took the view that there was nothing too significant in those comments. And so it signed. So you get to a stage where the minister, and the next slide, the minister signed the regulations. And at that time, there was a huge campaign by the alcohol industry just to try and stop that signature being placed on those regulations. And so you get all this hysteria across Europe, largely in Europe, where ambassadors from various countries are sent into Dublin to try and just rail and decry the action that's been taken, and these type of headlines were generated out of it. And indeed, the minister, the Italian ambassador to Ireland, the French ambassador to Ireland, took public positions in Ireland in relation to it, which was quite unusual. I mean, you generally don't see that sort of thing. Next slide, please. And obviously, in the WTO process, the meeting subsequently, Paula will probably know about this. Obviously, Australia was one of the countries who lodged disharmony around it, but also the US, Mexico, Dominican Republic, Japan, Colombia, Canada, you can see them there, all tabled concerns. And that battle is still going. It's ongoing. There was a meeting only last week. And so they will fight tooth and nail to try and bring about some measure of delay, I'm sure, in relation to that. But obviously on the counter side, we had the EU was now representing Ireland and was making a full-blooded support of what Ireland was doing, and the EU is on board with that. And similarly with the WHO Global, they made presentations to support Ireland as well. So next slide, nearly there, last slide. So yeah, he signs the thing. As I said, the WTO is still going, and so we're now at a point where, the title of the talk was, citizens have a right to know. The genie's out of the bottle. So my point really is that the genie is out of the bottle now, because this battle has been fought and this battle has been won. I think, it's generally now recognised that even at a modest level, that the citizens have a right to know the basic understanding of what is, the inherent risk within alcohol use. And it's kind of to go back to Robin and where we started, like from your point of view and from my point of view, I think, this is a Rubicon. I see this as a Rubicon moment. It's because you can't go back from this. That's the point. The real point from public health is, we've had 20 years of ambiguity and debate and discussion and everything. But once you get there, it's like tobacco. Once you get there and you cross that line, it's extremely difficult for them to go back. So whilst Ireland is taking a very progressive, courageous stance in relation to cancer, I think in the end, it'll only be a matter of time before every country in the world does this. That's my sense of it. So thank you for your time. I hope that was of some interest.
Thank you, Eunan, very much. So we now have Professor Emmanuel Kunchak, who's the Director of the Center for Alcohol Policy Research at the Trobe University, who's going to offer a few comments on Eunan's presentation. Thanks, Emmanuel.
All right, Eunan, thanks so much. That was a big privilege to listen to your presentation. I thought it would be helpful just to have a couple of comments why this is so important. And we heard already some of that in your talk, but I just perhaps reiterate that. According to WHO, alcohol is in top 3 of avoidable or of health burden worldwide, after childhood obesity and unsafe sex worldwide. And if you look to high-income countries, the order change a bit. So tobacco comes on top after obesity, and then alcohol still at position 3 worldwide. When it comes to Australia, there had been a couple of surveys in the last 2 decades showing that the burden of alcohol and the total health burden in Australia varies between 5 and 12% overall. And you mentioned already, alcohol, as most of you know, is a causal factor in 200 different disease and injury conditions. Hundreds of studies, and it's interesting that the alcohol industry denies that. Hundreds of studies have demonstrated a link between alcohol and different kinds of cancers, breast, liver, colon, and so on. And that is from the first drink onwards. So each drink actually adds to the cancer risks. And that is good, to inform people about that. In Australia, in particular, alcohol kills more than 4 people each day and produces 182 million of avoidable costs, 182 million each day, day after day. It's difficult to imagine, actually, as a number. When it comes to cost-effective and effective strategies to reduce the burden from alcohol, WHO recommends that to raise awareness about the health and social problems caused by alcohol. And one of the best ways is to do that directly on the product, right? So to have health warning labels that inform about liver disease, cancer, and mental health problems. And that is the case actually for everyone, not just for pregnant women, as the Australian label is. So the Australian label that was introduced a couple of years back informs, it's actually called health pregnancy warning label, pregnancy warning label, not health warning label. That alcohol can cause lifelong harm to your baby, and it's not just the baby, it's the health warning labels there on the screen now. This year, the Foundation for Alcohol Research and Education did a national poll and found that 78% of the population is actually in favor of introducing more informative health warning labels. This is similar to the figures in Ireland, I suppose. So therefore, yeah, Ireland's example is so important, and I really congratulate you for this progressive and brave action. And Australia should commend you and follow your example. Thanks so much for your presentation.
Thank you.